Welcome back, everyone, to the Spiritual Bazaar. I hope you're doing well, however you are and wherever you are. This is and this is an anonymous audio cast by someone on the road to recovery while exploring spiritual paths and the mystery of life. Today I have my second guest on, Dr. Richard House, author of Between Now and When, subtitle How My Death Made My Life Worth Living. And actually the subtitle is a pretty good synopsis for the book, but there's a whole lot more to his story, and we're going to welcome Richard on in just a second here to welcome him and get a little bit more about that story. But as many of you know, addiction really is a serious problem. Beyond the individual addict's struggle, there is the consequences that it has on the friends, family, and society at large. The health costs to our society are enormous, in the billions of dollars, because of health damages to the individuals, damages to those close to them, car wrecks, etc., etc. So I think one of the problems here is that a lot of people out there claim to feel that they understand the disease of addiction, and I think that's sort of just a rote repetition and repeating of what they hear on the news, or what they've perhaps been educated on in their classrooms growing up. I know that I had very little understanding of it coming out of high school and in our health classes. I really had no concept. It was more of a fear factor. So I think that if we had more people that understood what it means to be an addict and the consequences of that, and the sort of the psychology and the spiritual ineptitude of those that are dealing with addiction, I think if we can empathize with that a little bit more, then I think that we can heal more. And if we can heal more, then those side effects on our society and our health system would be greatly reduced. So a little bit about Richard. Dr. House has been practicing medicine for over 40 years, first as a traditional medical doctor, and for the past 20 years as an acupuncturist utilizing the chakras for energetic healing. His travels have taken him around the world 3 times and to most of the United States for meditative and higher dimensional work. He lives in North Carolina on an organic farm with his family and enjoys beekeeping and animal husbandry. Pretty cool. He holds a 2nd degree black belt in Taekwondo, also pretty cool, and is proficient with the longbow. Dr. House may be followed on Facebook and Twitter. Richard, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so your story is essentially about finding out who you are as a person, but a part of that story is your struggle with addiction. So before we get more into your actual spiritual journey, can you talk to us a little bit about what the root of your addiction was? What did you use, and why do you think you used it?
Sure. I'll answer the last part first. Alcohol was my drug of choice, no question about it. And I started drinking in college. College is a wonderful place to learn things. And I certainly learned how to drink in my fraternity. So,
like so many other fraternities.
Oh, man, yeah. And there is no question that was part of my world education. And of course, the results of that learning brought me to a near-death experience, which we will talk about later. But in terms of why, this is a question that bounces around in AA rooms. And I don't think anyone has a real handle on the why, because so many people just start drinking casually like I did, and there is no particular reason. But jumping ahead a little bit, what I'd like to say is that the solution or the pathway for recovery is spiritual. So another way to say it is that the solution is spiritual, therefore the problem has to be spiritual. And most of us are unaware that we are on a spiritual journey. We just live life, we have kids, we go to school, we have work, and we don't understand that all the while we are on a spiritual journey.
Right. Well, for me, it is 100% about the spiritual journey. That's the difference now, I think, than before for me. I had an understanding of the addiction, but I really didn't understand that there was something inside of me that was missing that I needed to work on. So, and for the sake of anonymity, I do not refer to what program I use, but I do use a 12-step program. And, this time around, I have a commitment to it and to my recovery that is far more fierce than ever before. And again, that has a lot to do with the consequences of my actions that led me there. So for you, what was the pain that got you into needing or seeking recovery?
I think it was the general pain of existence, to tell you the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I came from a good family, and had most of the advantages that we can have on earth. And I had plenty of love in my life, and so I can't really say that there was any one thing that caused my problem. But what I probably should tell you very briefly is that I knew at a very early age that I was going to encounter some significant problems. When I was about 13, I was minding my own business, just being a teenager,
Mm-hmm.
and all of a sudden there was this sort of message that came through in my awareness, and somehow I knew that this message was divine in nature, and the message was quite simply, you will die at the age of 33. And of course, as a teenager, I really didn't know what to do with that information, but I have to admit that I believed it, man. I mean, I was convinced that this was truth. But after I kind of recovered from the shock of the experience, I thought, well, what do I do with that,
Yeah,
And
and I imagine you came around to confronting that, but is that something that kind of haunted your thoughts growing up?
no, and that's the interesting part. After I recovered from the shock, I just picked up my skateboard and kept right on going. And to tell you the truth, I forgot all about it until I was 33.
So you had a sort of cosmic connection on a skateboard. I love that.
Yeah, yeah. And so the reason I point that out is that here at a very early age, I was given an awareness that I was in fact going to die
Mm-hmm.
at an early age. And so in a sense, the filler years were what led me to that. And in my case, it was addiction. It could have been something else, I guess. But the fact that each one of us has sort of a scripted program that we work through is what I took home from that in later years. In other words, there I am, 33, dying of alcohol. And of course, I was a physician at the time, and I was a bad alcoholic. I mean, I wasn't just a little casual one. I had end-stage liver disease. I was drinking a quart of Jack Daniels a day, and some other interesting recreational stuff. And when you drink that much, it takes away your humanity. And I found myself sinking into this nightmarish world that I knew nothing about at the time, the astral world.
Yeah.
And so I was seeing demons and trying to run away from hallucinatory images. I mean, it was an awful mess.
Well, are you familiar with Dr. Ohm?
I don't think so.
Well, that was one of his last stages that he described as for the addict, is that when your health starts to fail you. And then a lot of people, they have different bottoms, of course. But ultimately, the last stage is your health, because no matter what you're going through psychologically, when your health starts to fail, all else fails.
If we don't have our health, we don't have anything.
The old adage.
Yeah, Howard Hughes was a good example of that. Here's a billionaire who is shut up in a little room and scared to death of germs. So yeah, if we don't have our health, we don't have anything.
Right. All right. And so you talked about this voice that you heard, but there's a little bit more to that story, right? Is that the voice that you heard, is that also the other voices that you've heard since and before?
Yeah. The first time it happened, I was 7 years old, and as a 7-year-old kid, I was just doing what all kids do. But one day I was standing underneath a big tall tree, and all of a sudden I experienced this wonderful sensation of being one with everything. The totality of all existence I experienced as myself. Sort of a soul experience, I've heard some people call it. I think the Buddhists call it satori. And of course, as a 7-year-old, I really didn't know what to do with that. And afterwards, it left me with this a very interesting feeling of being not just a 7-year-old kid, but also being sort of divine also.
Right.
And that's an amazing duality to carry around, in your childhood.
That's a heavy load.
A heavy load, man.
Yeah.
But it was good. Now, the divine part, of course, gradually melted away when I hit puberty, and I've heard other people talk about similar things. So when I hit about 12 or so, in fact, it happened all at once. I was walking home from school, and between one footfall and the next, this feeling of unity with God went away. I mean, it was gone. And I was, once again, a scared kid. And, you were asking why I was drinking. Well, that might be it. I never really thought about it. But as soon as I had my first beer, I said, whoa, hey, this is better. And so I didn't drink to get drunk. I drank in order to feel normal, trying to recapture that divine essence that I seem to be missing.
Sure. So it's as if had you not lost that connection, then maybe you would have had no need to fill it with anything else.
Well, you're right, and that would have been a terrible. In order to... I hesitate to get into this because I know some of your listeners are not ready for this kind of philosophy. But in order to really understand addiction, you have to look at it from the standpoint of reincarnation. That our journey is not just this lifetime. And see, that's why when I was 7, I had that experience, I think, because I had been working up to this lifetime for quite a long time. And I experienced addiction in other lifetimes. And so my view, and I understand that it might be a minority view, is that we have addiction over a period of several lives, and it's only when we get sober that we can move on to the next stage.
Okay, well, it sounds a bit like karma then.
Yeah, it is. Exactly. And so when I say it would have been a shame if I hadn't been encumbered with addiction, I say that because I wouldn't have had a chance to transcend it, because that's what the name of the game is. The
Yeah.
spirit, the 12-step program is what? It's a program of transcendence.
Right.
As you probably know, it was based on the Oxford group from
Mm-hmm.
England's 12-step program, and it was sort of co-opted by Bill Wilson, the founder of AA. So he pulled in that because he knew that all of us that are dealing with addiction and trying to maintain a sober recovery need to have some sort of program to get rid of all the crap that we bring to the table, and then to start growing spiritually. And that's what the 12 steps are all about.
Sure, yeah, and not to diverse from our topic here, but the interesting thing about that too is, and I think this is a great reflection for everyone, is the difference between the Oxford group and the AA program, 12-step program that Bill Wilson founded, is that it is completely, well, the Oxford group was open, but the AA program did not allow for the appropriation of the program by any other entity, hospitals, corporations, religious groups. It kept it completely 100% self-supporting, and more importantly, I think that's completely non-denominational. So you have atheists in there, you have Christians, you have Muslims, you have Hindus, and all these different people and each of those people have their own view of a higher power, and you have all these people from different walks of life and different belief system and religions and spirituality or non-religion, all working together to be better people. And I think if all of society was like that, we would live in a near blissful world, I think.
Well, I hope we get there one day.
I hope so too.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is, in my view, one reason that addiction is so prevalent today. Instead of getting better, it seems to be getting worse, if you want to call it that, in the sense that more and more people are struggling with addiction. In fact, it's hard to find someone who isn't, when you throw in not only the common addictive substances, but how about food?
Oh, everything, yeah.
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 I see every day in my practice, I see people who are addicted to food. Yeah, I can't even talk to them about it. I can't. I had a fellow in yesterday, and his heart is given out. He's one of my neighbors, to make it even more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "What? Okay, Charlie, what did you have?" He's 100 pounds overweight. I said, "What did you have for breakfast today?" He said, "A sausage biscuit." And I said, "Charlie, that's not good for you. You shouldn't be eating biscuits." "Yeah, doc." And that's about as far as that one went. So
Yeah.
we have 60% of the population now in America, at least, is overweight. 40% is obese. What do you call that if it isn't addiction? And then, of course, we have gambling, which is now, man, we were in Montana a couple weeks ago, and every place you go, there are slot machines, and then you throw in some sex addiction, and I think porn is the number one thing that people find on the computer now.
Sure, yeah.
So how many people are struggling with addiction? Almost everyone.
Yeah, I think to some degree, and obviously we all have our bad habits that we develop, but I think something with food addiction, I think it's easier for people to ignore for a longer period of time because unlike substance or drug addiction, the consequences aren't always immediate. So I think it makes it a little bit more difficult to come to terms with the fact that you might have a problem with that because, you're not, drunk driving, you're not going into blackouts, you're not starting fights at the brawl because you ate too much. And so I think, so people see it as like okay, well, maybe I have this addiction, but it's not like, a drug addiction. And I think that if we could sort of bridge that gap between all of our little addictions and bad habits, and understand that there is a similarity between all of us, and some it just has to be, it's more extreme than others. But if we can help each other come to a mutual understanding and have empathy for each other, I think that's a good place to start,
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And the problem with food is you can't be totally abstinent like you can from drugs and alcohol.
Exactly.
You gotta face your addictive substance every day.
Very good point. Yeah. Yeah. So, if I tried to do a little bit of this or that, well, I'm right back to where I started. So yeah, obviously, like drug or alcohol addiction that's a completely different beast in that sense. But the psychology behind it, I think, is similar.
The same. Yeah, it is exactly the same. We're feeding an empty spot, and our little neurons in the brain make us do things that we don't want to do. And the chemical receptors in the brain that become habituated to endorphin-like substances that are released when we indulge in our addictive substance cannot be tamed. It's just very, very difficult. But getting back to where I was going with this,
sure.
Why is there so much addiction now? I feel like the transcendence of addiction on a universal basis is what will lead us into the next age.
Really, that's a pretty big statement.
Yeah, it is. And I've been thinking about this for some 40 years or 30 some years, I guess. Let's see, just for anyone that's curious, I think my last drink in any kind of psychoactive substance was 31 years ago. So I've had some time to think about it. And what I see in my practice every day is people that are struggling. But each one of us has the wherewithal to transcend not only our addictions, but there are also addictions in relationships. We didn't even get into that. But when on a universal basis people start turning towards their higher self, and however you want to call it, then I think we're going to see this age meld into the next.
And it's an odd thing to think that addicts are a part of leading that process.
But think about it.
Yeah.
Addicts are forced to get with the deal. The STEP program is admitting what? Number one, that you're powerless over your addictive substance. Another word for that is surrender.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. The thing that keeps us from experiencing God like I did when I was 7 years old is the ego. And what does the ego do? The ego says, me, mine, I want, I'm in charge, watch out, that kind of thing. The ego is protective, it is strident, it is an ugly thing. So surrender is where you give up those ego functions and you say, thy will be done.
Well, I've talked about this a little bit on a previous episode. What's your take as a practitioner in basically psychology and sobriety? What is the ego? What is its actual purpose? In 2 seconds, no.
Okay, sure. The ego actually means almost the same as mind. We prize our ability to think and to have logical direction in our life, but the mind and ego are almost identical. I would separate it into also a division between the higher and the lower self. Of course, this is an Eastern concept that we haven't embraced very well in this country. In the Christian religion, the lower self is many times described as the devil. The devil made me do it. Or Satan, get behind me, that kind of thing. Well, it's the lower self. And the interesting part is that if you go back to the Sufis and some of the other spiritual traditions, the lower self is always with us. We are born with the lower self. In other words, we are born with non-virtues.
Non-virtues. Okay.
Non-virtues. And that would be hatred, greed, selfishness, pride. It goes on and on. I should have had my list here because I always forget what they are. Jealousy. So here we have those as a basic foundation for our human self. Now, in Christian religion, that's called original sin. In the East, they just call it non-virtues that are there for us to work through. So what we do is we transcend those. They never go away. Your hatred never goes away. But what you can do is develop through the higher self the counter to it. So you develop virtues that balance out the non-virtues. So instead of hatred, we have love, and so on and so forth. In fact, love is almost the opposite of every one of the non-virtues. So our life on earth is to develop these virtues. So the ego is mostly involved with the lower self. Mm-hmm. And we can develop a spiritual ego, which, once again, is a higher self. So what happens when we have addictive substances in our bodies? Now, I'm not talking about food. Don't get me wrong on that. But, with drugs and alcohol, we start living through the lower self and not the higher self. We are selfish. We are jealous. We have hatred. We're angry. Does that sound kind of familiar? And so what we learn through the 12 steps is to develop the higher self. And so when that occurs, you can live through that higher self, and the word and the light spreads.
I guess that's where service to others comes in.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Because you are denying your own desires in favor of those of someone else.
All right. And you were going to say something else.
Yeah, I was going to say this. There's this fellow Ram Dass. Do you know who he is?
Be Here Now. Yep.
Yeah, Be Here Now. Right.
Yep.
His real name is Richard Alpert. Richard Alpert. He was a professor at Harvard about the time that Timothy O'Leary was kicking around. But so Ram Dass had a sort of a spiritual awakening after taking LSD, which sometimes does happen. But he did it with Timothy O'Leary, and but Marabhava told Ram Dass to stop the drugs, and he did. And so he lived a life of transcendence of the non-virtues. He traveled around talking. He wrote books. He's a great guy. Mm-hmm. And right before he had a stroke, he's still with us, so far as I know, but he did have a very debilitating stroke, and he calls it being stroked by God. Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
That's an optimism. Very, very positive attitude.
Very positive. Yeah. There's actually a film that was about him, a biography. But anyway, an interviewer before he had the stroke said, "Okay, Ram Dass, you've been doing all this spiritual work for 20 years. How has it changed you?" And his answer to that, and I'm paraphrasing, was, "I still have the same thoughts that I did before, of jealousy, envy, hatred, and so on." He says, "The only thing I've learned through all my spiritual work is how not to act on them."
Yeah, that sounds like something the Dalai Lama has said as well.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's sort of the root of Buddhism. Is it's not, you're not just hitting the delete button and these things disappear forever. It's that would be great, but maybe it wouldn't be great actually, because like you said, it's sort of that learning and that struggle to get through that and overcome that actually makes us better people. And then exactly in recovery, it's the same thing. For your behaviors as well as the desire to use again, it's always going to be there somewhere. So it's more of a practice of prevention and a practice of learning how to deal with thoughts as they come into your mind.
So yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
That's well said. Well said.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I hear people talk about the obsession being lifted, quote lifted, and I think that what that means generally is that the vast majority of your waking time you have zero urges, but then you hear about people who are sober for years, and something happens, something triggers it, and the beast is awakened, and if they are not prepared mentally and spiritually, then they could easily be taken out again. And often do.
And you're right. Unfortunately, it does happen. There was a fellow I knew who was 20 years sober, and going to meetings and all that, and he got a girlfriend. Yeah, and so the girlfriends took the place of him going to meetings, and then one day he picked up a drink and he was dead in a few weeks. So yeah. Now
something I've struggled personally with in my life is thinking, okay, well, if I love someone enough, that should be enough for me to not use again or to change my behavior. And it's a hard thing in sobriety because, like the saying goes, you lose everything that you put before sobriety.
Oh, you're right. Oh, that's a good way to put it too. I like that. I haven't heard that before. Yeah,
and I think it's the same thing as a spiritual practice. I mean, it's when you're like Ram Dass, I mean, the constant working on it and tweaking and trying to make yourself better, that has to be sort of your primary purpose, because how you behave and react to others or handle situations or make decisions are all rooted from, if you want to make good decisions, are all rooted from that practice.
In other words, you're living out of your higher self.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's what you've been working on.
Sure. Yeah, we all do. And, when you come in contact with someone who is living out of their higher self, you want to be around them. Even if you don't know what's going on with them. There is a certain gravitation, because you know that this someone has something that is hard to get. It's sort of like wearing a gold necklace or something. You say, wow, isn't that cool? And this is unconscious, but, if you can walk and share that light, it's like 1,000 pinpoints of light. Who was it that said that? Anyway, it does spread, and it is contagious. And so if you hang out with people that have what you want, you will get better. You should always play tennis with somebody that's better than you are.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah, and for a long time, I didn't surround myself with people who were trying to make themselves better, and I wish I did. But no, I'm not going to play tennis. But let's get back to your story. So we don't have a lot of time. We've got about 25 minutes left here. So let's get back to your story. So we heard this voice, and what was the name of the self or the voice that you referred to in the book?
When I was 7 and I had that incredible experience, I tried to find a name for myself that was more accurate than my given name. And for me, and I've heard this from other people that experienced it, they did the same thing. But for me, the name was, of all things, Ichen, I-C-H-E-N. And I happened to say that in one interview a while back, and the guy said, I looked that up, and it actually has meaning, and it is a spiritual name. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool, because I sure didn't know it at the time. But, once again, when you have an experience like that, it tells you that there is more going on than meets the eye. And I think that's a message I'd like to leave with your listeners, because so much of the time we are wrapped up in the mundane, and you hear about someone like me that's had this kind of thing, and go, and the average person says, oh yeah, well that could never happen to me. But the truth is that it could happen to you, and I hope it will, when you can join with that divine energy. But what happened was, I probably ought to tell you this because it's pretty good. When I was in the hospital, the doctor came in, I was in the ICU, and he said, we've given you 18 transfusions. The blood was coming out everywhere. And he said, I don't see any point in giving you any more blood. I'm going to turn the blood off with your permission. You say goodbye and you'll be gone in a few hours. And I said, "Hey, listen, man, this world sucks. I'd rather get out of it. Yeah, please turn the blood off. I'm done." And I was 33, of course. And so that's what they did. I said all my goodbyes, and then about in the middle of the night, an amazing thing happened. For the first time in my life, I felt a wave of what I can only call comfort. From the time I was 7 until that moment, I had been uncomfortable, and that's why I was drinking all that. But finally, I felt this incredible wave of comfort, and that comfort segued into what can only be called bliss. And I felt like I was being sort of embraced by God Himself. And as this experience intensified, I left my body. You've probably heard this in other people that have had near-death experiences. But I left my body, and I could see the yellow thing. I was so yellow from the jaundice from liver failure, and down there. And then, once again, this wonderful, divine voice said, "You will heal and work for Isa." Now, I didn't understand that, but it means God. So, in other words, it said, "You will heal and work for me." And, if I had been able to stand up and salute and say, I would have said, "Yes, sir." And I was perfectly willing to go back into that miserable world that I had just left. Now, I didn't understand it at the time, but I was in a supra dimension, a higher dimension. And when your consciousness is in that dimension, and if you still are connected with your physical body, your body will heal. And that's exactly what happened. I went back into the body, and, within less than a week, I walked out of the hospital. So far as I know, I'm the only one that's ever survived with the problem that I had.
Yeah, that's quite impressive.
Yeah, and that, my doctors were a little surprised too. It was cool, but
because they were playing the waiting game. They thought that was it.
Yeah, that's right, and I surprised them. Yeah, and
well, good for you.
Today, I have to tell you, I'm 70 now, and I can't hardly believe that. But and I don't take any medicine. I don't have any health problems at all.
And you sound sharp as heck for 70.
Well, thank you. And
that's coming from someone in the 30s.
So when I'm talking about healing, what have we healed? We've healed more than the physicality. Yeah. We've been healing on a little higher level than all that. But I know we don't have much time, but this is something else I want to say. I was introduced to higher dimensions consciously after that. It was amazing. I found that I could shift into this other dimension while I was just doing ordinary stuff, walking on a sidewalk, going to get some breakfast, and all of a sudden there was a shift, and the whole world kind of tilted, and everything I saw was incredibly beautiful. The sounds I heard were so glorious, and the smells were so beautiful. And here was the thing that I really noticed, after I got sober, of course, my wife had fallen in love with someone else, and I had all these financial troubles, and this and that and the other. But all the worry went away when I was in that state. I could think about the problems that I was having, but there was no emotion connected with it. I was perfectly fine with it. And that I later found out is what is sometimes called the subtle world. And it is a dimension that is, if you want to say higher than this one, yes, but it's also underneath this one. It's the infrastructure for what we see. What we see as a beautiful sunset is not anything like the real glory of what makes that sunset appear in our gross world. So that was pretty cool. So the reason I want to say that is that for people that are just living ordinary lives and getting a paycheck and all that, believe me, there is more going on than meets the eye. Not only is it beautiful, it's rational. It's all happening with a plan, and we're a part of the plan, every one of us. And there's nothing that happens that's untoward. It may seem that way. It may seem like our suffering is pointless. or that there's evil in this world. And you can turn on the news and it's pretty easy to believe. But all the evil has a purpose as well. That
Yeah,
was a grand statement, wasn't it?
that was a fantastic statement. I may go back and play it again. Um, when you said the something about the sunset, you actually reminded me of the earlier part of your book, where you're on this I guess like a cottage on the beach in Hawaii.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And you were having these extreme depressive mood swings, but this was occurring after you had actually gotten sober, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so and then you had this spiritual awakening, which came a little bit later. So when you said in the book, "My surrender was the key," how did you get to that point?
Oh my. Yeah, that was you know, when we finally get where we belong on this earth, which in my case was sober, all kinds of wild things happen. It's sort of like you carry all this baggage that needs to be cleaned up.
Yeah.
And I did not have depressive states or bipolar or anything like that before. But after I was sober and doing meditation every day in Hawaii, that's why I was there. I sort of guided to go to a place where it's good for meditation, and islands are good for meditation. So here I am meditating all the time instead of frolicking on the beach with everyone else. And I started having these incredible bipolar experiences where I would sink into this horrible depression. I mean, the kind that makes you cry without any particular reason. Man, I didn't even go out. I couldn't get groceries or anything.
You just
And
felt
then,
paralyzed.
oh, awful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it just came out of the blue. It was not connected with circumstances at all. And then 3 or 4 days later, I'd be on the top of the mountain, and I would think, "My God, I can't believe I felt so bad." And I thought, surely this is the last time that will ever happen. But guess what? I'd wake up on the couch, a day later, and boom, I'd be right into that depressive state. And so after a while, we don't get these messages on the TV about what to do. But there is an inner teacher that leads us. And so I finally figured out that this roller coaster that went on for weeks and weeks had some purpose, because it clearly wasn't a result of my circumstances.
It wasn't just something external triggering it.
No. And so finally I was in the midst of this horrible depressive state, and I was at about midnight, and it was raining outside, and I went out, and I was in a bad neighborhood in Hawaii, and there is such a thing. And I thought, oh God, this really sucks. And I sank to my knees, and then I got it. I thought, hey, I can tolerate this. I've been doing this for weeks, and I know that I'm going to be okay. And I turned up to God, and I said, all right, give me more. I can take it. And that was the end of it.
So thinking in terms psychologically, do you think the actual trying to control it was what was making the struggle even more? And then it was the surrender of just accepting, okay, this is what's happening, and there's a reason for it? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, exactly right. I left I was trying to control it. I left notes for myself. When I was feeling good, I wrote a note and said, "Buck up, fella, you're going to be all right in a few days." That kind of thing.
But did you look at those notes and go, yeah, well,
Yeah.
F you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. But that's the way we are. And so that's how we learn. We don't learn when things are mountaintop experiences. I mean, they're wonderful, but we learn when things are not going well.
Yeah, I think you're right about the mountaintop experience. It can, it does give you that sense of grandeur, and there's something bigger and greater than you, and it's beautiful. But actually living in that place on a day-to-day basis is a different approach.
Yeah, and I don't know that the divine will allow you to do it forever and ever. You do see some people that seem to be blessed from the day they're born until they die, but it's pretty darn rare. I would guess that almost all of us, if not all of us, have suffering as one of the bases for our experience on Earth. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to go around whining And if you come into my office, I prefer that you don't whine.
Mhm.
But, by golly, suffering is something we all have to learn to accommodate.
So do you talk to people on a daily basis about addiction, or is it just all kinds of different, problems that you have to discuss with patients?
Yeah, most of my work is not really verbal. I work through the chakra system,
Okay.
and so what I'm doing is using what I've come. Let's see, how's a good word? My chakras are pretty damn clean, and so they're working well. And so when people come in,
Oh, Rich, I lost you there. Just see if you can check your volume level on your
okay,
headset. There you go. Yep, I got you back. You're good.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and so it's a almost like a non-touch healing thing, and then of course we'll discuss stuff that comes up.
Sure. So what do you think is more immediate in its effectiveness? The non-touch or the discussing?
What do you think?
Well, if we're talking about energies, I guess that's at the speed of light or faster. So I'm guessing the non-touch. But for me, I mean, going to meetings every day and talking about stuff and hearing other people share their stories, that's extremely healing. And on a daily basis, for me, it's pretty much essential.
Yeah, you're right. But there's something else that happens in the rooms. How much time do we have left?
We've got about 10 minutes left.
Okay. One day when I was going to AA meetings on a regular basis, this was before I went to Hawaii, I made a commitment to my sponsor in AA to go to 90 meetings in 90 days, and that's sort of the common contract. And so one day I developed this terrible cold. I mean, it was one of those snotty businesses where you don't want to get out of bed. And I thought, well, I made this contract, and so I decided to go to a meeting anyway, but I waited until it was already going so I wouldn't have to talk to people ahead of time. And I slipped into the back row and with my little packet of Kleenex and started listening to what was going on. And when I walked out of that meeting, probably 45 minutes later, my cold was gone. And I thought, wow, how does that work? Well, it's what we were just talking about. All the people in that room had energetic influence on each other. In other words, as it says in the Bible, where two or more are gathered in my name, there I will be. And so when you go to a meeting, the verbal stuff is really great. I mean, it is how we learn from the experience of others. But there's also something going on in that room that can actually help you with your physicality.
Yeah. Well, I can understand that. Yeah, there's times where when you're in a group of people that are sharing something, all of a sudden you'll feel this sort of growth of kinetic energy that's being passed around, and you walk out of the room and it's like, you say to somebody else, whoa, that was a great meeting. And when you think about the words that were actually said, it's the similar kind of words that you've heard time and time before.
Precisely. That's exactly it.
But it was the energy that was carried on the words, I think, that was effective.
Right. And getting down to recovery. In AA, it's well known that the greatest correlation between recidivism or with recidivism, in other words, having a relapse, is not going to meetings. So another way to say it is that if you go to meetings frequently, your chances of staying sober are so much better because of this energy that's in the rooms.
Yeah, you're sort of rejuvenating yourself.
Yeah, you're cleaning yourself up. Yeah.
Yep. So I don't want to, give away the ending of your book because I think it's fantastic. But can you tell us a little bit more about this journey to find a particular someone?
Yes. Not all of us are on a journey that takes us around the world. Mm-hmm. But in my case, I sort of awakened an inner teacher that did lead me around the world. And so I went from Hawaii to Fiji and Australia and India, and of course in India I contacted some incredible human beings and also some incredible energy there. And so I traveled across the continent and ended up in Calcutta. And as you mentioned, that I go into some detail in the book on this because it's really pretty unusual for someone to have experience what happened with me. And so that's why I finally wrote it down. These experiences occurred some 30 years ago, but I finally decided it was worthwhile to put it in print. And I did contact that inner teacher, and ever since I have had that same experience of duality. In other words, I feel myself as a 70-year-old sitting here talking with you, but at the same time I have this conscious awareness of the divine always. And so the book goes into how that occurred, and then I went to London where the whole thing was consummated. It was pretty interesting. And then finally, whenever any of us is allowed to experience these things, there is a reason. It doesn't just happen. It's not like winning the lottery where there's no responsibility afterwards. It always comes with a duty. And so I started my work on behalf of the larger humanity in New York City. And since that time, I have traveled all over the world many times and visited most of the states. And so what I do is energetic work through the chakra systems whenever I'm not in the office. Did I answer that question? I'm not sure I did.
Kind of, sort of. But I'll just say this, that you did come across somebody who had an immediate impact on you, a sort of transferring of energy, right?
Oh yeah, you're talking about Marabhava. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Marabhava is a spiritual teacher in India. He actually dropped his body in 1969, so I never met him in person. But through a whole sequence of events, I've came to understand that this great soul, who is now an ascended master, was the one that was leading me around from the time I was 7 until today. And so
so there was a connection from his consciousness to yours, you're saying?
Yes.
That whole time?
Yeah.
That's wow, okay.
Yeah. Huh. And so these things do occur, but they're very rare. And I wish I could tell other people how to have it happen to them. But and since our time is short, what I would like to say is that this business of the higher and lower self is really the pathway to the divine. Whether it's through addiction and a 12-step program or just working your own personal program without addiction, if you're so blessed. But our daily life gives us many opportunities every day to either engage in virtuous behavior or in selfish behavior.
All right, and I'm going to ask you this one last question before we go.
Okay.
Is there a way for someone to be an atheist and actually, take heed your advice and experience this?
Oh, absolutely. An atheist is connected with the opposite of God, but since there's nothing but God, then there is no opposite. So an atheist is just as spiritual as someone who believes in God, even though they may not know it. That was the best response I've heard to that question. That is fantastic. Cool. Richard, thank you so much for being on the program. Oh, my pleasure, eh?
And your website is richardhousemd.com, correct?
Yeah, it is. And if anyone wants to read my book, you can get it through that website. It clicks you right onto Amazon, or just go directly to Amazon. And anyway, the book is available.
Okay, very cool. And hopefully sometime in the future we'll do this again, because there's so many more questions, like the who am I question and so much more. So again, thank you, Richard. It's an honor to have you on. And just so anyone who is curious would like to know, the artist who does the intro song to this show, is Nathan Daniels. You can always contact me, ask me questions about the show, and I'm on spiritualbazaar.com. You can contact me through email, or you can find me on Twitter at spiritualbazaar, BIZZARR, and Instagram, spiritualbazaar. All right, that's it. Richard, thanks again, and to everyone else out listening there, be well.